Hi, I'm Greg Kutsona, co-director of science for the church. And I'm really excited today to be talking with Dr. Alison Cook, who's a podcaster, psychologist, and author of two books that I'd like to highlight. The first, co-written with Kimberly Miller, is Boundaries for Your Soul. And the second and more recent is The Best of You, Break Free from Painful Patterns, Mend Your Past, and Discover Your True Self in God. And in my book, Alison is actually even better known in my family for having done some retreats with my wife, Laura, doing good well, which were powerful and fabulously effective. So, Dr. Alison Cook, welcome, and I'm really excited to talk with you.
Oh, I'm really excited to talk with you. I've heard so much about you through your wife all these years, and I'm such a big fan of your wife and of your work. So it's great to be here and to meet you finally in this way.
It's really good. And as we got a chance to talk a little bit before this interview, it's been really great to read your book and to also just listen to your podcast. And I feel like I've got a real sense of who you are. So you have an ability to be present in even through those different media, which is a skill. And one of the things that you do in The Best of You is you start with this striking story. And I'm wondering if you can recount what you describe in that book and how it led you to write The Best of You.
Yeah, I had a blog and I'd send out a weekly newsletter, and it was a Thursday in early September a few years ago. And this Thursday afternoon, I was wrestling with this idea, and it's kind of along this idea, it comes out of my own journey of struggling with codependency, struggling with kind of losing myself in the name of helping other people, and kind of feeling like that was a good Christian woman thing to do. And I had finally kind of put some words on it that just felt like that is what I've been struggling with for so long. And it gets at this idea of kind of uncovering the self. Anyway, that very next day, and it felt very, I'll never forget, the moment of just kind of it going out of my fingers, into, it's not always like that as a writer, where you're writing and you're struggling with words. And then it was like, this is what I really need to say. And I'm in my 40s, healthy, no known medical conditions. But the very next day, I had, out of the blue, a stroke. And that weird juxtaposition, to this day, I still don't understand necessarily what was in that. But I describe in the introduction of The Best of You that stroke, because while I was okay, I'd never had something. I'd never been in an emergency room before. Suddenly I'm in a helicopter, it was such a trauma. And then the juxtaposition of that happening right after I'd felt like, oh my gosh, I think I've finally cracked the code on something I've been wrestling with for 2 decades, was very oddly paired in my brain. And so when I went through the process of healing from that trauma, both physically, but also emotionally and spiritually, all of that was in there. And so it was like, I have to write about this because it was the kind of the crucible in which this book got born.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, one of the things, obviously one of the key ideas in that book is the creating a true self, and I loved a section in the book, which is talking about yeses and nos. And I'll just have to make a personal statement in that I wrote this book called Say Yes to No when I was at a point in my life where I just said way too many yeses. And I came up with this concept of the nurturing no, and I think it seemed to resonate with what you're doing. So maybe we'll go right to that right now, since that just emerged. So I want to read from a part of your book when you talk about what is the true self. And here's what you say. Your true self is the person you really are, the person God made. It involves a deep understanding of your strengths, needs, values, and purpose. It's finding and expressing your voice with other people. It's knowing that you have what it takes to course correct even when you make mistakes.
Yeah.
So that's a great paragraph. How would you describe that? Something else you'd like to add to that about finding our true self?
Well, I've always struggled with the static notion of the true self, false self dichotomy.
Yeah.
Some of that is what I love about what we wrote about in my first book, the parts model of we're really a whole family of parts. There isn't a true and a false, it's kind of a false binary. And so but I also like this idea of we are wanting to become our fullest, truest self. And what does that mean? And so for me, that's why for me, it's very important as a human self, as someone who is not, and won't be this side of heaven, won't be fully, made whole, that part of that moving toward trueness is, first of all, it's not static, it's movement, it's a process. But second of all, it encompasses, oh, that was a moment where I flipped into some of those survival skills, or that was a moment where and actually that's not being my true self. That's part of an awareness of this truthing in action, in process. So for me, it very much encompasses some of the parts of our blind spots and the parts of us that are still not quite there yet, in that growing awareness. And even being honest, I love that say yes to no. I love those kind of dichotomies. It's almost like there's truth and honesty in our moments of dishonesty, in our moments of inauthenticity, as we become aware of them to greater degrees. So
yeah. And I know I jumped into this more recent book, The Best of You, and we'll get back, I think, to building that from your work, your extensive work with internal family systems, or IFS, which I really want to ask you about. But I was so interested in how that connected deeply with, with some of your own story, right? I mean, it seems like one way of describing the stroke, and I have my own health issue that starts the book that I mentioned, is you just stretch yourself too thin, I think there's a line in the Lord of the Rings. It's like butter spread too thin on the bread. It's like this life that's a little bit too thin. And so there's a way in which we need to nurture ourselves, because this is because we've been created good by God, and because we want to be available to others. So maybe you could, I do really want to get to internal family systems, but I wonder first if you could just say a little bit more about how do we get that balance, or whatever language you'd like to use, between giving out and also nurturing yourself in a positive but not selfish way.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I talk in the book about, in The Best of You, about this idea of selfhood versus selfishness versus selflessness. And again, I think in church communities, we put so much focus on selflessness, on denying yourself. And I spend a lot of time in the book unpacking that, because that can become a really toxic message, versus selfhood or true self, which, in the way that I distinguish it sort of in simplest terms, is, selfishness is it's all about me. Selflessness is it's never about me. Selfhood is it's about you, and it's about me. I do need to have a seat at the table. It's not all about me, but it is partly about me. It's partly about you. It's partly about, we do need to bring ourselves into our relationships. I think as it relates to the stroke, Greg, and this is a journey that I'm still on. It's been the slowest piece. If we look at ourselves as mind, emotion, spiritual, mental, emotional, spiritual, and physical beings, that body piece has been the hardest for me. And with the stroke, one of the things that came out of that, because there's nothing wrong with me, none of the typical things, right, that would lead to it. And so we started to have to look at, and sometimes they happen, sometimes, but the scientist in me is like, there's got to be a cause for this, even if it's just an anomaly. But one of the factors for is I'd always kind of taken my body for granted. And it was during COVID. A lot of my clients were in crisis. And I was sitting, we looked at my Fitbit the 2 weeks prior to that stroke, and I was getting maybe, I don't know, the number of steps I was getting was just terribly unhealthy. And we know that sitting, is a risk factor,
Right.
is terrible for your health. Again, that's not the only reason. There are other factors that went into it. But as we started to piece together, there was this neglect of the body that I, again, coming out the other side of it, where I've had to change. I've had to bring the body, this embodied soul, into my spiritual practices. And so my true self also includes my body. It also includes, like, when my body has limits to my helping, that I can't bypass that spiritually.
Yeah.
I actually need to pay attention to that. Jesus had a body. I talked a lot in the book about Jesus had a sense of self, and part of it was honoring the limits of his body.
Yeah.
So those are some things that, I don't flesh out. I flesh out a lot of that in the book, but it continues to grow for me. This whole true self, this essence of who God made me to be, includes my body.
Yeah.
And my body isn't something to kind of bludgeon into submission. It's something to steward and honor, just as my emotions are, just as my mind is, just as my spiritual life is.
Yeah. Yeah. That's so important. And I think part of what I'm learning in terms of like mindfulness practice and so on is to root yourself in your body, to
Yes,
not be distracted from what you're actually experiencing and the sensations of your body.
yes.
Um, I want to go one more step with this before we look at internal family systems. I know they're related because you're
Yeah,
building,
yeah.
your work and your insight and what you're expressing to the world. But just back to one other thing, you do write with women particularly in mind, as
Mhm.
far as I'm reading the book. And one of the things, I can only say this in sort of a funny way. I remember listening to a podcast on the Enneagram, and Lisa Gungor, who was on this
Mhm.
podcast, was talking about how many Christian women find themselves in the 2 on the Enneagram, which is kind of
Yeah.
the helper, and when Lisa Gungor found out that she was a 2, she started crying. And I can only laugh because I think a lot of us get squished into the molds. I mean, like Romans 12:1 and 2 says, don't be conformed to the patterns of this world. And a lot of us get squished into molds. And it seems to me that women can get put in this mold of the helper to the
Yeah.
detriment of the self. So there's a question in there somewhere, but I'm making it broad so you can respond however you want. Do you think that's true for how many women are affected by either the Christian world or the broader world? And also, how does your book speak to that for your readers?
Yeah, it's interesting you raise that. In hindsight, I've heard from so many men that they found the best of you so resonant with them. That's the one regret I have is I think I might have broadened it more,
Mm-hmm.
because I've been surprised at how many men have said, "Oh no, this is for us too,"
Mm-hmm.
especially in faith communities. I think I just see it so predominantly among women. I actually am one of those women who thought I was a 2 on the Enneagram for years, only to discover I am not. It was a of my conditioning, as happens for so many women. So I do think that there's a layer of it for women. I think you could also take that there's a layer of it for any marginalized group, people of color, where there are these, we're all kind of dealing with this sense of especially in in our faith communities, in these Christian communities where we're supposed to look this way on the outside to other people. And then it just takes different nuances for women, for men, for different groups of people. And my experience as a woman, just with this, what I talk about in the book as the fawn response, which
Mm-hmm.
is a survival response to threat, of really learning how to win people over, to please people as a way to stay safe. It's really a survival form of codependency, of I'll just betray myself to make sure you feel great. And then I'm also called a really beautiful Christian person. That's
Mm-hmm.
I'm validated for that. I'm praised for that. And I just see it so much among women that was really where I wanted to try to peel back that layer and go, wait a minute, is that really the motto we see in Jesus? Number one, no.
Mm-hmm.
Is it really how we think God wants us to show up in the world? Is it really what affects change in other people's lives? It's not,
Yeah.
but it's just so prevalent.
Yeah.
This way of putting on the mask, of being kind, of being pleasing, of being a pushover in many ways,
Yeah.
versus really showing up in an empowered, embodied way, which really is what we see in the life of Jesus.
Yeah. That's so good. And I do think your book speaks to men. It speaks to me as a man, at least. I can speak for that. One of the roles I also am in right now is as pastor. I've done that for 25
Yes.
years plus. And so there's a lot of that too that goes into pastoring, that Enneagram too, that's what I'm talking about.
Yes.
But also just to say resonance factors for people who don't know your book offhand, I think there's also that side that we have as men, like the silent, like warrior kind of just going to keep going no matter what, and that can press
Yeah.
us into molds that aren't very helpful. and hide the self, so anyway, I just think there's a lot there in what you've
Yeah.
done, and I thank you for it. I think
Yeah.
there's a courage there to name some of those structures, and a courage to be, when you're your true self, you're more vulnerable. That's part
Yeah.
of the truth of the matter, it seems to me.
I say that a lot in the book. I found myself saying people might not like it, but
Yeah.
because that's not the goal, right? The goal is when you show up more visibly, when you show up more honestly, you might not make everybody happy, but that's also no longer the goal. And there's a deeper satisfaction that comes from the inside out that is very intangible and hard to describe until you experience it. The freedom of, oh, I get to show up in this way, and now I don't have to care
Right.
so much how other
Right.
people receive that.
Yeah, I mean, freedom is a big word for. I
Mhm.
mean, it's a significant word for what you're doing,
Yeah.
and obviously, it's in the title. If I'm not mistaken, I'm doubting myself now, but I mean, I think that's part of what you really
Yeah.
lead people to, right? Yeah, break free
Yeah.
from painful patterns, right, and free for what God wants us to be.
That's right.
So let's go to internal family systems, or IFS. And I want to start because it was a moment before we were talking on this recording where I introduced you with the wrong name. I think I said Alison Clark, and for goodness sake, I've never used that name about you, although we haven't met in real time. I certainly have talked with you with my wife Laura, and read, like, it's just not, I don't know where
Yeah.
that came from. But here's the thing. I think, as soon as I said that, I felt embarrassed, ashamed.
Mm,
And part of my life is to be an academic, and academics
mm,
are precise. They know things. And I esteem your work, so I want to be presenting myself well to you. So there's that sense of embarrassment, right? And
mm.
maybe, I don't know if you want to use that, but maybe it'd be an interesting way to talk about what perhaps could have been emerging from the perspective of internal family systems when you feel like that. You feel like, I want to go somewhere else here. I want to do something else instead of this moment. And I might have
Mhm.
a behavior that all of a sudden pops out of nowhere, Uh, like I said, maybe that's an odd entry to internal family systems, but for me, it was definitely brought out one of those parts of my
Yeah.
personality that wants to just go somewhere else than where I am at that moment.
Okay. What I loved in that moment was when that happened, that you immediately kind of checked and were aware of the embarrassment. We're like, oh, there's a part of me. It was so true self to me. It was so just spirit led self, of kind of acknowledging the moment,
Mm,
which allowed it to be a moment that we could both kind of smile about and enjoy, versus if you had kept that in your body, right? If you'd been like, oh, and you kept that shaming part of you in your body, beating yourself up, then that's going to continue to infiltrate out through the rest of the interview where you're not enjoying the interview, where you're not present to the interview. So, sure, a part of you may have kind of come in that moment of excitement. That happens to me all the time. Part of me, and it happens to all of us. We go, oh man, I'm so excited about this. And I just said this thing that I wish, oh, what did I say? But in fact, it's very endearing, right? Because
mm,
we're being kind of we are in the moment, right? Which is why we're
right.
not so scripted, or right, why we go off script. Those parts of us are very endearing. But that's not the problem. What's the problem is when that inner critic, the part of us that wants to beat this up, or the shaming part of us comes in, and then we double down and our whole bodies just kind of clench, and
Mm,
then we hide ourselves, versus what you did, which was so lovely. You just said, oh, now I'm gonna have to ask that part of me that's gonna, to step aside, and then you're right back in it,
yeah.
which is
Well, can I just give
the
a quick
journey.
compliment to you? Is like, I mean, just being saturated in your material for the past few days, particularly, it was very present to me to think about how could I use the internal family systems to take in that moment. You know what I mean? And I'll just add that, one of the things that I could have done just is literally just to lie and say, oh, I actually wrote Clark down in my script. That's why I did that. You know what I mean? Like, to be so ashamed, you want to actually make up something that doesn't
Yes.
even exist, right?
These parts of us, I mean, even right now, Greg, talking to you, I'm aware. I'm like, I want to do, because I've known Laura, and I really have so much respect for you. And I know you're an academic, and I'm parts of me are like, am I being academic enough? Am I being too, there's 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 a lot going on inside of our minds and our hearts in any given moment. And the joy, it's not, we're not trying to get those parts to go away with this model, this internal family systems model. The joy of it is to go, oh, there you are, old friend, old nervous friend, or old, oh, I so want to impress friend. You can be here. You just can't take me over, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then all of a sudden you're kind of having, it's fun. You're at peace with yourself, not because you're showing up perfectly, because you're at peace with, okay, here we are. You have a little bit of an inner eye roller with yourself. And you can kind of settle in and just be a more whole person in the
Yeah.
moment.
Well, I know I'm delaying you from actually giving me a bit of a systematic approach or sketch of IFS, but I do want to say I think that's what makes you such a popular podcaster or podcast host and writer, is that authenticity. I think that's what speaks to people in what you do. So I appreciate that, and I appreciate that because I think it's really valuable for us. I think we live in, I don't think it's just us as Americans in the 21st century, but at least us as Americans in the 21st century live in a world of presentation. And I think social media has made us, have to present ourselves in certain ways, for example, but a lot of different things. Anyway, I think that ability to help us really take down those masks, or to put aside that part, as we'll talk about a little bit more in a minute, those really are helpful to create a connection.
Yeah.
I just think you did a good job with that. And
Thank you.
I affirm that. I love it about what you do.
Thank you. It's such to me, it makes life so much more full and rich and interesting when this work in the model, which is, these parts don't go away.
Mm-hmm.
And so we better learn to just enjoy them and learn how to be with them. And that's been such a big part of my own journey of healing.
Yeah. Well, you did such a wonderful job of describing internal family systems in one of your podcasts, which I'll link when I do the transcript and write-up of this interview. But can you describe in a brief way what internal family systems does and how you've connected with the Christian faith?
Yeah, it's a model of therapy founded by Dr. Richard Schwartz. It's a pretty simple premise. The best way to get a glimpse of it is to watch the Pixar movie Inside Out. It's just this idea. Yeah. It's so good. It's just this idea that we are comprised of parts. And I think that's pretty intuitive for most of us. But what Dr. Schwartz did was break it down into 3 categories of parts: the manager parts of us that want to please and produce and perform. Those are the parts of us that we show up within the world. Those parts of us are the parts of us that want to prevent pain. They want to prevent us from making a fool of ourselves. And those are the parts that show up, when we're trying to put our best foot forward. The firefighter parts of us, which are the parts of us that come in to douse out the flames of pain after we feel it. So these are the parts of us that try to divert our attention away from the pain to alcohol, to food, to drugs, to TV, to social media, to you name it, whatever form of numbing or coping that just kind of gets us away from the pain. So those 2 different categories are protectors. They're trying to protect us from pain. They have different strategies for how to do it. And then there's a 3rd category of part called exiles. And these are the parts of us that actually carry the painful emotions, the painful memories that we try to shove down. These are the parts of us that actually need us the most. These are the parts of us that carry loneliness, that carry shame, that carry sorrow. Sometimes we exile anger, especially for women. I talk about that a lot, but I think a lot of us do as Christians, just these painful emotions. And so the goal of parenting this internal family, well, there's a 3rd thing so in the middle of these 3 categories is the self. Now, Dr. Schwartz called it the capital S self, and he really brought this spirituality. This is an evidence-based model of psychology that says he believed the self is spiritual and self-healing. Mm-hmm. And that as you begin to bring the different parts of the soul, we call it the soul, he would call it the self, into connection with this capital S self, they self-correct, they start to heal, and they go into proper balance. Proper balance doesn't mean any of them goes away. It means they harmony with each other. Sometimes we do need to show up and put our best foot forward. Sometimes we do need to check out. Sometimes we do need to be in touch with our sadness, but we learn how to lead these parts of us in a healthy way. Kim and I, when we began to integrate this model with Christian faith and practice, we call it the spirit-led self, the place inside, as Henry Nouwen talks about, where the spirit lives inside of me. It's where God's spirit comes and inhabits me, or God's spirit comes and inhabits you. And it allows you to lead these parts of yourself in a really beautiful way. It doesn't mean, again, the parts go away, but we become increasingly aware of them, and we are able to channel them for good in our lives and in the lives of others.
Yeah. Wow, what a great description, because I think sometimes these complex psychological models can be difficult to understand. So
Yeah.
there was I think it's in the epitaph of your book, I believe, the Nouwen quote. This might be taking a risk to make sure this is right. Yeah, here it is. Before part one, first chapter, Henry Nouwen. Over the years, I have come to realize that the greatest trap in our life is not success, popularity, or power, but self-rejection. And
Yeah.
I think there's something, I mean, and that's again what made Nouwen so great, I think, as an author, is he recognized that.
Yeah.
So I don't want to, I'll pause if you want to say more of that, but I have one other thing from Inside Out, which I find so powerful in
Yeah.
relationship with this. Is that okay if
Yeah.
I go
Just,
with that?
oh, yeah, please go for it. Yeah.
I mean, that scene, and I don't know if I can say this without crying, because it really is so emotionally
Mm.
touching to me, is, the resolution to the film, as far as I see it, is when the key character, she's all the time trying to protect her sadness, right? And that it's not going to be, and within her mind, there's these other little people that have these globes that every memory has a certain color to it, depending on what kind of memory and how you're protecting memory, so they don't have sadness. Is the one joy keeps trying to do that, keeps trying to make every memory
Yes.
happy. And what the key character, I think it's Riley, finds out is that when there's sadness, it bonds us with other people. And she goes
I
back to that
know.
scene where I think she missed the goal in ice hockey. And it wasn't that the team was disappointed in her. It was that the team wanted to surround her because she was trying, And I just think that's such a beautiful image of the value of sadness and of grief.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So anyway, if you want to say more about that,
Yeah.
it's not much of a question there. It's just a resonance, I guess.
Well, when we exile that sadness, we miss out
Yeah.
on it. It contours, it textures. I was thinking about it recently, and actually, you had sent me a note about Susan Cain's book, Bittersweet, which I haven't read.
Yeah.
And I'm looking forward to reading it, because my guess is, just from the title and from knowing her work a little bit, this is a little bit of what she's describing. But I know in my own life, when that sadness, I think about the sad seasons of my life, and they bring so much also even to the joy. Um, and it is very intangible. It's hard to sometimes understand why it's so important. Even
Mhm.
loneliness, these painful emotions, they really do, they're precious parts of us. We don't want them to take us over. We don't, and this is the thing about these exiled emotions, we don't want them, when we don't tend to them and care for them and bring them to the seat of the table of our soul, and bring them into our relationships with others. Shared sorrow is half the sorrow, right? Shared
Yeah.
joy is twice the joy. um, we miss out on the depth of connection, on the depth of connection to ourselves, to God, and to others. And when we don't tend these emotions, they do ambush us, and that's when they take us out. And that's when sadness becomes full-blown depression, or loneliness starts to just dwarf any of the, or take over any of our feelings of connection. So it's such an interesting, Kim, my co-author, talks a lot about the image of the metaphor of the table. And when you see, the sadness right there, and when you talk about a team, right? I love that image that you said, where the team comes around her, wanted to come around her in that sorrow. And it's almost like you begin to feel that inside your soul. It's like that sad part of me, or that lonely part of me. And those other parts of me, instead of trying to shove it away, are like, it's okay, we're here with you. And there's this sense of, oh, yeah, I can be a couple of things side by side. I can be a couple of things side by side right now. And there's just a richness in that that's hard to describe, but just so beautiful.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, boy, there's just so much there. I have to say,
Yeah,
I'm just so bound up with the emotion of a life
yeah,
that is that beautiful,
yeah,
and that my role as a question asker is being limited.
right,
But
yeah.
maybe you could say then a little bit more about how you connect IFS with your faith as a Christian.
Yeah, I think
I mean,
when
maybe Allison, also how you connect it for other people. I mean, also for just the wider body. I mean, it can be personal, it can be more broad. So how is IFS connected with Christian faith in your work?
I think what I would say, there's a couple of ways to answer that question. I'm going to give you the in the moment way. The through line in all of my work, the two books I've written, the things I've wrestled with are this idea of a self. What does it mean to be a self? I loved God my whole life. I was raised in a Christian home. My dad read the Bible to us every morning around the breakfast table. A lot of safety, beautiful. Loved God, knew the Bible, wanted to follow Jesus. I loved other people always. I was a keen observer of other people, intrigued by other people, genuinely delighted and curious about other people. I had not one clue how to be a self, how to know myself, how to see myself, that the self mattered. In fact, up until my early 30s, I thought the self shouldn't be there. It was bad. And so the through line in all of my work since that time, since I had a breakdown in my early 30s, the two pillars are the breakdown in my 30s, which I write about in Boundaries for Your Soul, and then the stroke 15 years later in The Best of You, are that this unbelievably, Greg, beautiful thing to me that not only is God unfathomable, we will never get bored of trying to understand the living God and who he is. So are you, unfathomable. And so am I, unfathomable. Just as God is, we are made in God's image. And for me, again, I'm a psychologist. I geek out on personality tests and the nuances of understanding people and the nuances of the soul. It's like a surgeon, give me a person. And my poor husband and kids, are just like, stop analyzing us. But I love this stuff. But in my own soul, that it's just never boring. And
Right.
when you start to take shame away, it's like, this is just buckle up and just enjoy the adventure of life, because there's so much to continue to get to know in my own soul, in your soul, in God's soul. This is just, I can't think of a better way to live. And so, I didn't really answer your question other than to say those three: God, love of others, love of self. As cliche as that is, the self love, that triangle really is to me the joy of being alive. And when I think about the part, if we zoom in on the self piece, the fact that not only do we have a God out here, the transcendent God that we worship and love and are reverent of and who is holy, but that there's the Comforter, the Holy Spirit, Jesus in here,
Mm-hmm.
helping me, not taking me out, not shoving me aside, which is often what I felt like. It was just supposed to be Jesus and get me away. Mm-mm. It's Jesus who comes in at the center and lets me be more of me, helping guide these parts of me into greater fullness of who Allison is, who God made me to be. That's just been the joy of my life.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, that it goes hand in hand with worship of God, because we are his. I was telling my husband this the other night. I was like, I think God is delighting in what's happening. And he's like, it's so hard for me to understand. What do you mean by that? And I was like, he made you. The more you start to get it right, you don't, think about how we are about our kids. When our kids start to shine and start to crack open something where they're really thriving and really showing up as their best version of themselves, as a parent, we're like, that is awesome, because we had a little hand in making that. How much more is God so delighted in us? So I could go on and on about that, but that's a little bit of
I
it.
hear a sermon in here. This is awesome.
Yeah.
I don't mean that totally. I don't mean that
Yeah.
facetiously. I think it's a very
Yeah.
inspirational. I mean, I just have to say, I thought, boy, as you're talking even about personality profiles and so on, I was like, wow, I'd love to hear more about that. You're so passionate about it,
Oh,
right?
yeah. Yeah.
And I think that's really amazing. I would, if you don't mind, I'll throw in something I resonate with when you
Yeah.
say this, and I will also add, when in saying this, I'll make one more footnote to my footnote, that it's like there's so much I'd love to talk to you about in each of the things that you said. But when you were talking about, this idea of Christ in us, the hope of glory, as Paul writes, I also think about this experience that Martin Luther had in the Tower, where he'd always heard this phrase, the righteousness of God, that it was this external standard that he, as a monk, had to live up to. And his breakthrough in reading the book of Romans was that the righteousness of God wasn't God's external righteousness to us. Primarily, it was God working through us to make us righteous. Like, God is not going to give up on us. And I think I would add to make us beautiful, as Irenaeus said in the 2nd century, the glory of God is shown in a human being fully alive, and that was fully beautiful, right? And it's this just hope of that Luther found, that Paul writes about, that God will perfect us until the day of Jesus Christ. That I don't know, I just find that really a provocative and compelling and inspirational vision. So thank you for leaning into that.
It's not an obliteration of the self. N.T. Wright talks about how the more we become Christ-like, we become more fully human.
Yeah.
Less, we become more of ourselves, not less of ourselves in Christ, which for me was just such a freeing and liberating journey. And again, not that you become obsessed with the self, but it is a byproduct of all this work that we do, of just this, wow, this is cool. Like, I'm enjoying. Kierkegaard is another one of my favorites, and he talks about, being nailed to the self. At the end of it, when we meet Jesus, it's kind of going to be like, so we better get used to and comfortable with that person we're going to get nailed to. And I always thought that was an interesting. The more we know, the less we surprised we are when it's all revealed anyway.
I'm gonna allow myself one more excursus, but then I'm gonna get back to your questions for you, which is, there's a scene that C.S. Lewis puts in the Chronicles of Narnia that so exemplify. It comes to my mind when we're talking about this, as we come to Christ, our self is beautiful. And it's the scene where Lucy, who's one of the key characters in the Chronicles, is reading the book of magical spells, and one of the spells is to make her more beautiful than the lot of mortals. And so she hasn't said any spells yet, but she's like, okay, I've been good so far. I'm gonna do this one. This sounds really tempting to me, right? And I think this really plays out with how we define ourselves, like what makes us beautiful to the world. So she says the spell, and she becomes more beautiful than a lot of mortals. And she then sees her life before her, and how it creates envy, and how it creates acclaim, and how it creates all these different things. And at the end of the spell, it's because it passes apparently within that spell in the Chronicles of Narnia, Aslan comes up behind her, the great Christ figure, and says, basically, Lucy, I think you've been playing with spells. And she turns and she looks at Aslan, and this is the moment. I hope I can get this out. The way Lewis writes it, she says, at the moment she saw Aslan, she was as beautiful as the Lucy in the spell. Aslan, right. It's you, she said. And of course Aslan does correct her behavior, but there's that place of just seeing the face of Christ and becoming who we are created to be that will make us beautiful. Lewis captures it so well and shows all the spells that we want to put on the world, to present the beautiful self to those around us.
Which are the manager parts, to bring this full circle, right? Those are those manager parts of us that, to play out the Narnia theme, the Turkish delight, they think they have this imposter idea. Well, if I just could be more perfect, if I could just be more pleasing, if I can just produce more, can run the Enneagram wheel, that's when I'll finally be this idea of beauty, or this idea of acceptable. And they're not all wrong in the sense of their intentions are, her intentions, their intentions are to make sure that we're, but it's a counterfeit version when they're not connected to that place inside where the Holy Spirit lives, where that true thing that we long for has to be brought into tension with these sad parts of us, with these lost parts of us, with these doubting parts of us. The whole picture of who we are is actually where the beauty resides.
Mm, the beauty and the brokenness.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, I don't know if you're given over to the work of Mako Fujimura and kintsugi
Yeah.
art. Yeah. So I did an interview actually with Mako about this, and practiced kintsugi with his colleague Tiffany Thompson. Laura and I did,
Wow.
and all that beauty of the kintsugi model of, in the brokenness you find a new beauty.
Yeah.
It reminds me of that. Well, I want to ask you a few other questions before we wrap up, because again, we could talk forever. At
Yeah.
least I would love to do that. So let me just ask you, at Science for the Church, we're really interested in bringing the insights of science as a resource for the church, for the health
Yeah.
and vitality of the church. And I just want to maybe ask you a more generalized question to give you space to however you would like to answer it. How would you bring some of your psychological research and practice to a congregation to bless and enhance the ministry of that congregation?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think a part of me is tempted to go sort of very 30,000. I could go 30,000 foot, or I could kind of be tactical. I'll try to do a little bit of both. I think psychology and as a social science has sort of for a long time been at odds with the church, and understandably, because I think there are many ways in which when psychology came about, a lot of the founding fathers of psychology, so to speak, were kind of saying religion is bad and this is actually how we understand the world. And so they were put at odds. In my understanding, psyche as the study of the soul, which I think is the truer understanding of it versus the study of the mind, goes hand in hand more in the way that Augustine or Calvin even talk about, the study of the self and the study of God go hand in hand. So that's the first thing I would say, is
Mm-hmm.
that I think it's hard to, again, as Augustine and Calvin say, it's hard to know God if you don't know the self. And so the first thing I would say practically is I don't think we do anyone any favors with this sort of by obliterating the self, bypassing the self in church.
Right.
And I hear it just a lot. I just hear it now all the time, just now that I do this work so much. It's like, and I get it on one level that it's all about God or God. And I'm like, yes, yes, yes. And God uses us, and if in order for God to work through us, we have to know us, the us piece. So I think that's the first thing I would say is I think psychology can really inform the more we understand ourselves, how our minds work, how our emotions work, how our bodies work, how our nervous system works, the fuller our relationship to God and others. And that doesn't mean every pastor has to become a neuroscientist or a psychologist for sure. But I think there's so many great resources now. Kurt Thompson is doing such beautiful work in interpersonal neurobiology from a faith perspective. I think the work that I'm doing, there are others where you begin to understand, for example, if we're going to talk scientifically, the nervous system and how, man, if my nervous system is jacked up on a fight flight response, that's going to affect my spiritual practices. And that doesn't mean that I don't have faith or that I'm not disciplined. That means I need a different tool to heal holistically so that some
Mm-hmm.
of those spiritual practices could be freed up. So again,
Mm-hmm.
not that every pastor has to become an expert in trauma informed, faith or any of these things. However, I think just there's enough out there now that we can begin to change the language just a little bit in how we approach some of these conversations.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I will say it's interesting. Our talking today comes in the midst of my co-teaching a course on neuroscience and Christian formation with a psychologist and neuroscientist from our congregation, Leonard
Cool.
Matheson. And it's been fascinating just to learn more about, I don't know, like we were talking about the limbic system and the hippocampus, and he has this happy hippocampus exercise we're doing. So my point being, I think those tools that you and other psychologists bring can really help pastors
Mhm.
and people in the congregation to deepen their formation in Christ.
Yes, I think it's part of spiritual formation. I'm beginning to think of the work that I do as under the umbrella of spiritual formation. If we think about spiritual formation as not just about the spirit, but as about the mind, the heart, the soul, and even the body, this is all part of discipleship and spiritual formation.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Well, now I'm going to turn the tables. I don't know if these tables have ever been turned on you, but I'm going to ask you your final two questions you ask all your guests, if I'm not mistaken.
Oh no.
What or who is bringing out the best of you right now?
My husband, that might sound um what I mean, that can sound however it is, but we've been in a sweet season of empty nests. We've been through a lot, as you see in the best of you. When I had my stroke, my husband actually was a widower when we met. It was a big part of my story that I tell in the best of you. And then for me to go through my own health crisis, I mean, this is a guy who's been through a lot, and now we're in empty nest and just having a sweet season of bringing out the best in each other, which isn't always rose petals and, but it's just so sweet to see God's work in both of our lives. So that would be my answer right now.
Yeah. And then what needs or desires are you working to protect?
I'm working right now to protect my relationship to my physical body, to my physical health, to the food that I eat, to the way that I move my body as a form of spiritual practice. It's
Mhm.
very hard for me. It's almost like every morning part of my spiritual practice is to say, God, I have a body.
Mhm.
And part of loving you is caring for that body. So I'm working to create time and space for that.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's an important part of our
Yeah.
task as stewards of what God gives us, you know. Well, Allison, is there anything I forgot to ask? And or is there anything I should know about what's next for you in your work?
No, this was such a great conversation. I loved all the ways we went with it. I'm working on a book now that I'm just getting started, so I'm excited about that, and just kind of really enjoying the podcast and um, just seeing how to continue to bring more of these resources to people. So
Mm. Well, it's great. Allison, it's really been fun to talk with you and to get to know you even a little bit better. So thank you for your work. Thank you for your ministry. Thank you for the way you bring your insights as a psychologist and as a Christian together. So once again, thank you.
thank you. Thanks for having me.